Crewe by Walter de la Mare. When murky winter dusk begins to settle over the railway station at Crewe, its first-class waiting room grows steadily more stagnant, particularly if one is alone in it. The long, grimed windows do little more than sift the failing light that slopes in on them from the glass roof outside and is too feeble to penetrate into the recesses beyond. And the grained, massive, black-leathered furniture becomes less and less inviting. It appears to have been made for a scene of extreme and diabolical violence that one may hope will never occur. One can hardly, at any rate, imagine it to have been designed by a really good man. Little things like this, of course, are apt to become exaggerated in memory, and I may be doing the company an injustice. But whether this is so or not, and the afternoon I have in mind is now many years distant, I certainly became more acutely conscious of the defects of my surroundings when the few fellow travellers who had been sharing this dreadful apartment with me had hurried out at the clang of a bell for the down train, leaving me to wait for the up. And nothing and nobody, as I supposed, but a great drowsy fire of cinders in the iron grate for company. The most animated talk that had sprung up before we parted, never in this world to meet again, had been occasioned by an account in the morning's newspapers of the last voyage of a ship called the Hesper. She had come in the evening before, and some days overdue, with a cargo of sugar from the West Indies, and was now berthed safely in the Southampton docks. This seemed to have been something of a relief to those concerned, for even her master had not refused to admit that certain mysterious and tragic events had recently occurred on board, though he preferred not to discuss them with a reporter. He agreed, even with the reporter, however, that there had been a full moon at the time, that, apart from a heavy swell, the sea was as calm as a mill pond, and that his ship was at present in want of a second mate. But the voyage of the Hesper is now, of course, an old tale, many times told, and I myself, having taken very little part in the discussion, had by that time wearied of her mysteries, and had decided to seek the lights and joys and coloured bottles of the refreshment room, when a voice from out of the murk behind me suddenly broke the hush. It was an unusual voice, rapid, incoherent, and internal, like that of a man in a dream, or under the influence of a drug. I shifted my high-backed, ungainly chair, and turned to look. Evidently this, the only other occupant of the room, had until that moment been as unaware of my presence in it as I of his. Indeed, he seemed to have been completely taken aback at finding he was not alone. He had started up from out of his obscure corner beyond the high window, and was staring across at me out of his flat, greyish face, in unconcealed stupefaction. He seemed for a moment or two to be in doubt even of what I was. Then he sighed, a sigh that ended in a long, shuddering yawn. "I am sorry," I said. "I supposed—" But he interrupted me, and not as if my company, now that he had recognized me as a fellow creature, was any the less welcome for being unexpected. "Merely what I was saying, sir," he was mildly explaining, "is that those gentlemen there who have just left us had no more notion of what they were talking about than an infant in the cradle." This elegant paraphrase, I realized, bore only the feeblest resemblance to the violent soliloquy I had just overheard. I looked at him. "How so?" I said. "I am only a landsman myself, but—" It had seemed unnecessary to finish the sentence. I have never seen anyone less marine in effect than he was. He had shifted a little nearer, and was now, his legs concealed, sitting on the extreme edge of his vast wooden sofa. A smallish man, but muffled up in a very respectable greatcoat, at least 2 sizes too large for him, his hands thrust deep into his pockets. He continued to stare at me. "You don't have to go to sea for things like that," he went on. "And there's no need to argue about it if you do. Still, it wasn't my place to interfere. They'll find out, all right. All in good time. They go their ways. And talking of that now, have you ever heard say that there is less risk sitting in a railway carriage at 60 miles an hour than in laying alone, safe, as you might suppose, in your own bed?" "That's true, too." He glanced round him. "You know where you are in a place like this, too. It's solid, though." I couldn't catch the words that followed, but they seemed to be uncomplimentary to things in general. "Yes," I agreed. "It certainly looks solid." "Ah, looks," he went on cantankerously. "But what is your solid, come to that? I thought so myself. Once." He seemed to be pondering over the once. "But now," he added, "I know different." With that he rose and, dwarfed a little perhaps by the length of his coat, sallied out of his obscure corner beyond the high window and came to the fire. After warming his veined, shrunken hands at the heap of smouldering cinders in the grate under the black marble mantelpiece, he seated himself opposite to me. At risk of seeming fastidious, I must confess that now he was near, I did not much care for the appearance of this stranger. He might be about to solicit a small loan. In spite of his admirable greatcoat, he looked in need of a barber, as well as of medicine and sleep, a need that might presently exhibit itself in a hankering for alcohol. But I was mistaken. He asked for nothing, not even sympathy, not even advice. He merely, it seemed, wanted to talk about himself, and perhaps a complete stranger makes a better receptacle for a certain kind of confidence than one's intimates. He tells no tales. Nevertheless, I shall attempt to tell Mr. Blake's, and as far as possible in his own peculiar idiom. It impressed me at the time, and I have occasionally speculated since whether his statistics in relation to the risks of railway travel proved trustworthy. Safety first is a sound principle so far as it goes, but we are all of us outmanoeuvred in the end, and I still wonder what end was his. He began by asking me if I had ever lived in the country, in the depths of the country, and then, quickly realizing that I was more inclined to listen than talk, he suddenly plunged into his past. It seemed to refresh him to do so. "I was a gentleman's servant when I began," he set off. "First boot boy under a valet, then footman and helping at table, then pantry work and so on. Never married or anything of that. Petticoats are nothing but encumbrances in the house. But I must say, if you keep yourself to yourself, it sees you through. In time. What you have to beware of is those of your calling. Domestic. Well, that's the same everywhere. Nobody's reached much past the cat and dog stage in that. Not if you look close enough, high or low. I lost 1 or 2 nice easy places all on that account. Jealousy. And if you don't stay where you are put, well, there's precious little chance of pickings when the funeral's at the door. But that's mostly changed, I'm told. High wages and no work being the order of the day, and gratitude to follow suit. They're all rolling stones nowadays. Never mind the moss. As a philosopher, this white-faced, muffled-up old creature seemed to affect realism, though his reservations on the solid had fallen a little short of it. Not that my reality appeared to matter much, beyond, I mean, the mere proof of it, for though in the rather intimate memories he proceeded to share with me, he frequently paused to ask a question, he seldom waited for an answer, and then ignored it. I see now that this was not to be wondered at. We happened to be sharing, at the moment, this, for my part, chance resort, and he wanted company, human company. The last situation I was in, he was going to tell me, was with the Reverend W. Summers, M.A. William. In the depths of the country, as I say, just myself, a young fella of the name of George, and a woman who came in from the village to char and cook and so on, though I did the best part of that myself. The finishing touches, I mean. How long the Reverend hadn't cared for females in the house, I never knew, but parsons have their share of them, I'm thinking. Not that he wasn't attached enough to his sister. They had grown up together, nursery to drawing room, and that covers a multitude of sins. Like him, she was, but more of the parrot in appearance, eye face with a beaky nose. Quite a nice lady, too, except that she was mighty slow in being explained to. No interference, generally speaking, in spite of her nose. But don't mistake me, we had to look alive when she was in the house. Oh, yes. But that, thank God, was seldom. And in the end, it made no difference. She never took to the vicarage. Who would? I can hear her now. Blake this and Blake that. Too dark, too vaulty, too shut in, and in winter freezing cold, laying low maybe. And trees in front, everlastings, though open behind with a stream and cornfields and hills in the distance, especially in summer, of course. They went up and down, and dim and dark according to the weather. You could see for miles from those upper corridor windows. Small panes that take a lot of cleaning, but George did the windows. George had come from the village too, if you could call it a village, but he was a permanency. Nothing much but a few cottages and an outlying farmhouse here and there. Why, the old brick church lay about a mile away from it, I can't say, to give the roaring lion a trot perhaps. The Reverend had private means, naturally. I knew that before it came in the will. But it was a nice fat living notwithstanding, worked out at about £50 to the pigsty, I shouldn't wonder, with the vicarage thrown in. You get what you've got in this world, and some of us enjoy a larger slice than we deserve. But the Reverend, I must say, never took advantage of it. He was a gentleman. Give him his books, and tomorrow, like yesterday, and he gave no trouble. None whatever. Mind you, he liked things as they should be, and he had some of the finest silver I ever lay finger on, and old furniture to match. I don't mean furniture picked up at sales and such like, but real old family stuff. That's where the parrot in the family nose came from. Everything punctual to the minute, and the good things good. Soup or fish, a cutlet, savoury, a glass of sherry or Madeira. No sweets, though he was a lean, spare gentleman, silvery beard and all, and I have never seen choicer fruit than came from his houses and orchard, though it was here the trouble began. Cherries, gauges, peaches, nectarines, old red sun-baked walls 9 or 10 feet high and a sight like wonder in the spring. I used to go out specially to have a look at them. He had his fancies too, had the Reverend. If any smoking was to be done, it must be in the shrubbery with the blackbirds, not under the roof. And sitting there in his study, sir, he could detect the whiff of a cigarette, even in the furthest of the attics. But tobacco's not my trouble. Keep off what you don't need, and you won't want it when you can't get it. That's my feeling. It was, as I say, an easy place, if you forgot How quiet it was. Not a sound. No company. Not a soul to be seen. Fair prospects, too, if you could wait. He had no fancy for change, had the Reverend. Made no concealment of it. He told me himself that he had remembered me in his will, if still in his service. You know how these lawyers put it. As a matter of fact, he had given me to understand that if in the meantime, for any reason, any of us went elsewhere, the one left was to have the lot. But not death. There, as it turned out, I was in error. But I'm not complaining of that now. He was a gentleman. I have enough to see me through however long I'm left. And that might be for a good many years yet. The intonation of this last remark suggested a question, but my confidant made no pause for an answer, and added argumentatively, "Who wants to go, I should like to ask? Early or late, and nothing known of what's on the other side." He lifted his grey eyebrows a little, as if to glance up at me as he sat stooped up by the fire, and yet refrained from doing so. And again I couldn't enlighten him. Well, there, as I say, I might have stayed to this day if the old gentleman's gardener had cared to stay too. He began it. Him gone, we all went, like ninepins. You might hardly credit it, sir, but I'm the only one left of that complete establishment. Gutted. And that's where these fine gentlemen here were talking round their hats. What I say is, keep on this side of the tomb as long as you can. Don't meddle with that hole. Why? Because while some fine day you will have to go down into it, you can never be quite sure while you are here what mayn't come back out of it. There'll be no partings there. I've heard them trolling that out in them chapels like missel thrushes in the spring. They seem to forget there may be some mighty unpleasant meetings. But what about the further shore? It's my belief there's some kind of a ferry plying on that river. And coming back depends on what you want to come back for. Anyway, the vicarage reeked of it. A low old house with lots of little windows and far too many doors. And as I say, the trees too close up on one side, almost brushing the glass. No wonder they said it was what they call haunted. You could feel that with your eyes shut. And like breeds like. The vicar, 2 or 3, before my own gentleman, had even gone to the trouble of having the place exorcised. Candles and holy water, that kind of thing. Sheer flummery, I call it. But if what I've heard there, and long before that gout of a George came to work in the house, was anything more than mere age and owls and birds in the ivy, it must badly have needed it. And when you get accustomed to noises, you can tell which from which. By usual, I mean. Though more and more I'm getting to ask myself if anything is anything much more than what you think it is, for the time being. Same with noises, of course. What's this voice of conscience that they talk about? But something you needn't hear if you don't want to. I'm not complaining of that. If at the beginning there was anything in that house that was better out than in, it never troubled me. At least not at first. And the Reverend, even though you could often count his congregation on your 10 fingers, except at Harvest Festival, so wove up in his books that I doubt if he'd been roused up out of them even by the last trump. It's my belief that in those last few weeks, when I stepped in to see the fire, as often as not he was seeing asleep over them. No, I'm not complaining. Live at peace with who you can, I say. But when it comes to as crusty a customer, and a Scotchman at that, as was my friend the gardener, then there's a limit. Mengus, he called himself, though I can't see how, if you spell it with a Z. When I first came into the place, it was all gold that glitters. I'm not the man for contentiousness, if let alone. But afterwards, when the rift came, I don't suppose we ever hardly exchanged the time of day but what there came words of it. A long-legged man he was, this Mr. Mengus. Too long, I should have thought, for strict comfort in grubbing and hoeing and weeding. He had ginger hair, scanty, and the same on his face, whiskers, and a stoop. He lived down at the lodge, and his widowed daughter kept house for him, with one little boy as fair as she was dark. Harmless enough as children go, the kind they call an angel, but noisy, and not for the house. Now why, I ask you, shouldn't I pick a little of this gentleman's precious fruit, or a cucumber for a salad, if need be, and him not there? What if I wanted a few grapes for dessert, or a nice apricot tart for the reverend's luncheon, and our Mr. Mengus gone home or busy with the frames? I don't hold with all these hard and fast restrictions, at least outside the house. Not he, though. We wrangled about it week in, week out, and him with a temper which once roused was past all reasoning. Not that I ever took much notice of him until it came to a point past any man's enduring. I let him rave. But duty is duty. There's no getting away from that. And when, apart from all this fuss about his fruit, a man takes advantage of what is meant in pure friendliness, well, one's bound to make a move. Job himself. What I mean to say is, I used, occasionally, window wide open and all that, the pantry being on the other side of the house and away from the old gentleman's study, I used occasionally, and all in the way of friendliness, to offer our friend a drink. Like as with many of old Adam's trade, drink was a little weakness of his, though I don't mean I hold with it because of that, but peace and quietness is the first thing, and to keep an easy face to all appearances, even if you do find it a little hard at times to forgive and forget. When he was civil, as I say, and as things should be, he could have a drink and welcome. When not. But it came to become a kind of habit, and to be expected, which is always a bad condition of things. Oh, it was 1,000 pities. There was the Reverend, growing feeble as you could see, and him believing all the while that everything around him was calm and sweet as the New Jerusalem, while there was nothing but strife and agrimony, as they call it, underneath. There's many a house looks as snug and cosy as a nut, but crack it and look inside. Mildew. Still, our Mr. Mengus had prospects. Up to then, well, there came along at last a mighty hot summer. 5 years ago, you may remember. 5 years ago next August. Oh, an extraordinary hot summer, and an early harvest, necessarily. Day after day I could see the stones in the stubble fields shivering in the sun, and gardening is thirsty work, I will say that for it, which, being so, better surely virgin water from the tap, or a drop of cider, same as the harvesters have, than ardent spirits. Whether it is what you are bred up to or not, it stands to reason. Besides, we had words again, and though I can stretch a point with a friend and no harm done, I'm not a man to come coneying and currying favour. Let him get his own drinks was my feeling in the matter, and you can hardly call me to blame if he did. There was the pantry window hanging wide open in the shade of the trees, and day after day of scorching sun and not a breath to breathe. And there was the ruin of him, within arm's reach from outside, and a water tap handy too. Very inviting, I'll allow. I'm not attesting, mind you, that he was confirmed at it, no more than that I'm a man to be measuring what's given to me to take charge of by tenths and inches. It's the principle of the thing. You might have thought, too, that a simple honest pride would have kept him back. Nothing of the sort. And no matter, wines or spirits. I'd watch him there, though he couldn't see me, hiding behind the door. And practices like that, sir, as you will agree with me, can't go on. They couldn't go on, vicarage or no vicarage. Besides, from being secret, it began to be open. It had gone too far. Brazen it out. That was the lay. I came down one fine morning to find one of my best decanters smashed to smithereens on the stone floor. Irish glass and all. Cats and sherry. Who ever heard of it? And out of revenge he filled the pantry with wasps by bringing in overripe plums. Petty waste of time like that, and some of the greenhouses thick with blight. And so things went, from bad to worse, and at such a pace as I couldn't have credited. A widower, too, with a married daughter dependent on him, which is worse even than a wife, who expects to take the bad with the good. No, sir, I had to call a halt to it. A friendly word in his ear, or keeping everything out of his reach, you may be thinking, might have sufficed. Believe me, not for him. And how can you foster such a weakness by taking steps out of the usual to prevent it? It wouldn't be proper to your self-respect. Then I thought of George. Not compromising myself in any way, of course, in so doing. George had a face as long as your arm, pale and solemn, enough to make a cat laugh. Dress him up in a surplice in Asquith, he might have been the Reverend's curate. Strange that for a youth born in the country. But curate or no curate, he had eyes in his head, and must have seen what there was to be seen. I said to him one day, and I remember him standing there in the pantry in his black coat, against the white of the cupboard paint. I said to him, George, a word in time saves 9. But it would come better from you than from me. You take me? Hold your peace till our friend's sober again and can listen to reason. Then hand it over to him. A word of warnings, I mean. Say we are muffling things up as well as we can from the old gentleman, but that if he should hear of it, there'd be fat in the fire, no mistake. He would take it easier from you, George, the responsibility being mine. Lord, how I remember George. He had a way of looking at you as if he couldn't say boo to a goose. Swollen hands and bolting blue eyes. As simple as an infant's. But he wasn't stupid. Oh, no. Oh, nobody could say that. And now I reflect, I think he knew our little plan wouldn't carry very far. But there, whatever he might be thinking, he was so awkward with his tongue that he could never find anything to say until it was too late. So I left it at that. Besides, I had come to know he was, with all his faults, a young man you could trust for doing what he was told to do. So, as I say, I left it at that. What he actually did say, I never knew. But as for its being of any use, it was more like pouring paraffin on a bonfire. The very next afternoon our friend came along to the pantry window and stood there looking in, swaying he was on his feet, and I can see the midges behind him zigzagging in the patch of sunshine as though they were here before my very eyes. He was so bad that he had to lay hold of the sill to keep himself from falling. Not thirst this time, but just fury. And then, seeing that mere flaunting of fine feathers wasn't going to inveigle me into a cockfight, he began to talk. Not all bad language, mind you. That's easy to shut your ears to. But cold, reasonable abuse, which isn't. At first I took no notice, went on about my business at my leisure, no hurry. What's the use of arguing with a man, and him one of these Scotchmen to boot, that's beside himself with rage? What was wanted was peace in the house, if only for the old gentleman's sake, who I thought was definitely under the weather, and had been coming on very poorly of late. "Where's that George of yours?" he said to me at last, with additions. "Where's that George? Fetch him out, and I'll teach him to come playing the Holy Moses to my own daughter. Fetch him out, I say, and we'll finish it here and now, and all pitched I and half his words no more English than the mewing of a cat. But I kept my temper, and answered him quite moderate and as pleasantly as I knew how. I don't want to meddle in anybody's quarrels, I said. So long as George so does his work in this house as will satisfy my eye, I am not responsible for his actions in his off time and out of bounds. How was I to know, may I ask, if it was not our Mr. Mengus who had smashed one of my best decanters? What proof was there? What reason had I for thinking else? George is a quiet, unbeseeming young fellow, I said, and if he thinks it's his duty to report any misgoings on either to me or to the Reverend, it doesn't concern anybody else. That seemed to sober my fine gentleman. Mind you, I'm not saying there was anything unremediably wrong with him. He was a first-class gardener, I grant you that. But then he had an uncommonly good place to match. First-class wages, and no milk, wood, coals, or house rent to worry about. But breaking out like that, and the Reverend poorly and all, that's not what he thought of when he put us all down in his will. I'll be bound to that. Well, there he stood, looking in at the window and me behind the table in my apron, as calm as if his wrangling meant no more to me than the wind in the chimney. It was the word report, I fancy, that took the wind out of his sails. It had brought him up like a station buffer, and he was still looking at me and brooding it over as though he had the taste of poison on his tongue. Then he says, very quiet, "So that's his little game, is it? You had just a pair then?" "If by pair you're meaning me," I said, "well, I'm ready to take my share of the burden when it's ready to fit my back, but not before. George may have gone a bit beyond himself, but he meant well, and you know it." "What I am asking is this," says our friend. "Have you ever seen me the worse for liquor? Answer me that." "If I liked your tone better," I said, "I wouldn't say how I don't see why it would be necessarily the worst." "Eh? You mean yes, then?" he said. "I mean no more than what I say," I answered him, looking at him over the cruet as straight as I'm looking at you now. "I don't ask to meddle with your private affairs, and I'll thank you not to come meddling with mine." He seemed taken aback at that, and I noticed he was looking a bit pinched and hollow under the eyes. Sleepless nights, perhaps. But how was I to know this precious grandson of his was out of sorts with a bad throat and that, seeing that he hadn't mentioned it till a minute before? "I ask you." "The best thing you and George there can do," I went on, "is to bury the hatchet. And out of hearing of the house, too." With that, I turned away and went off into it myself, leaving him there to think things over at his leisure. I'm putting it to you, sir, as a free witness. What else could I have done? There was little light of day left in our cavernous waiting room by this time. Only the dulling glow of the fire and the phosphorescence caused by a tiny bead of gas in the mantles of the great iron bracket over our heads. My realist seemed to be positively in want of an answer to this last question, but as I sat looking back into his intent, small face, nothing that could be described as of a helpful nature offered itself. If he was anxious about his grandson, I ventured at last, it might explain his being a little short in temper. Besides, I should like to hear what came after. "What came after now?" the little man repeated, drawing his right hand gingerly out of the depths of his pocket and smoothing down his face with it, as if he had suddenly discovered he was tired. "Well, a good deal came after, but not quite what you might have expected. And you'd hardly go so far as to say perhaps that anxiety over his grandson would excuse him for what was little short of manslaughter. And him a good 6 inches to the good at that. Keeping facts as facts, if you'll excuse me. Our friend waylaid George by the stables that very evening, and a wonderful peaceful evening it was, shepherd's delight and all that. But to judge from the looks of the young fellow's face when he came into the house, there hadn't been much of that in the quarter of an hour they had had together. I said, "Sponge it down, George, sponge it down, and by good providence, maybe the old gentleman won't notice anything wrong." It wasn't to reason I could let him off his duties and enter into a lot of silly prevarications, which in the long run might only make things worse. It's that you have to think of when you're a man in my position. But as for the Reverend's not noticing it, well, there, as luck would have it, I was wrong myself. For when the two of us were leaving the dining room that evening after the table had been cleared and the dessert put on, he looked up from round the candles and told George to stay behind. Some quarter of an hour after that, George came along to me, snuffling as if he'd been crying. But I asked no questions, not me, and as I say, he was always pretty slow with his tongue. All that I could get out of him was that he had decocted some cock and bull story to account for his looks, the like of which nobody in his senses could credit, let alone such a power of questioning as the old gentleman could bring to bear when roused, and apart from what comes, I suppose, from reading so many books. So the fat was in the fire, no mistake. And the next thing I heard, after coming back late the following evening, was that our Mr. Mengus had been called into the house and given the sack, there and then, with a quarter's wages in lieu of notice, which, after all, mind you, was as good as 3/4 a gift. What I'm saying is that handsome is as handsome does, and that was the Reverend all over. Though I agree, mind you, even money isn't necessarily everything when there's what they call character to be taken into account. But if ever there was one of the quality fair and upright in all his dealings, as the saying goes, then that was the Reverend Somers, and I abide by that. He wouldn't have any truck with drink, topped with insolence. That's all. Well, our friend came rapping at the back door that evening, shaken to the marrow if ever man was, and just livid. I told him, and I meant it too, that I was sorry for what had occurred. "It's a bad ending," I said, "to a tale that ought never to have been told." I told him too, speaking as quiet and pleasant as I am to you now, that the only hope left was to let bygones be bygones, that he'd already had his fingers on George, and better go no further. Not he. He said, and he was sober enough then in all conscience, that come what come may, here or hereafter, he'd be even with him. Aye, and he made mention of me also, but not so rabid. A respectable man too, never a word against him till then, and not far short of 60. And by rabid, I don't mean violent. He spoke as low and quiet as if there was a judge on the bench there to hear him, sentence said and everything over. And then the old creature paused until yet another mainline train had gone roaring on its way. And then, though he wasn't found till morning, he must have gone straight out, and goodbye said to nobody. He must, I say, have gone straight out to the old barn and hanged himself. The midmost rafter, sir, and a drop that would have sufficed for a giant Goliath. All night. And it's my belief, goodbye or no goodbye, that it wasn't so much the disgrace of the affair, but his daughter, Mrs. Shaw by name, and his grandson that were preying on his mind. And yet, why, he never so much as asked me to say a good word for him. Not one. Well, that was the end of that, so far. And it's a curious thing to me, though they say these Romans aren't above making use of it, how going back over the past clears everything up like, at least for the time being. But it's what you were saying just now about what's solid that sets me thinking and keeps me repeating itself in my mind. Solid was the word you used, and they look it, I agree. He deliberately twisted his head and fastened a prolonged stare on the bench on which he had been seated. But it doesn't follow there's much comfort in them, even if they are. Solid or not, they go at last when all's said to what's little else but gas and ashes, once they're fallen to pieces and been put on the fire, which holds good, and even more so for them that sit on them. Peculiar habit, that too. Sitting. Yes, I've been told, sir, that after what they call this cremation, and all the moisture in us gone up in steam, what's left would scarcely turn the scales by a single ounce. If sitting is a peculiar habit, it was even more peculiar how etherealizing the effect of my new acquaintance's misplaced aspirate had been. His one and only lapse in this respect throughout his interminable monologue. Yes, they say that so far as this solid goes, we amount to no more than what you could put into a walnut. And my point, sir, he was emphasising with a forefinger that only just showed itself beyond the long sleeve of his greatcoat. My point is this. That's all there is to you and me. We shouldn't need much of the substantial for what you might call the mere soul look of things, if you follow me, if we chose or chanced to come back. When gone, I mean. Just enough, I suppose, to be obnoxious, as the Reverend used to say, to the naked eye. But all that being as it may be, the whole thing had tided over, and George was pretty nearly himself again, and another gardener advertised for. And I must say the Reverend, though after this horrible affair he was never the same man again, treated the young woman I mentioned as if he himself had been a father. I say the whole thing had tided over, and the house was as silent as a tomb again, aye, as the sepulchre itself, when I began to notice something peculiar. At first, maybe, little more than mere silence. What, in the contrast, as a matter of fact, I took for peace. Afterwards, not so. Well, there was a strain, so to speak, as you went about your daily doings. A strain. And especially after dark. It may have been only in one's head. I can't say. But it was there. And I could see without watching that even George had noticed it. And he'd hardly notice a black beetle on a pancake. At last, there came something you could put word to. Catch in the act, so to speak. I had gone out towards the cool of the evening after a broiling hot day to get a little air. There was a copse of beeches, which is perhaps, as you may know, is a very pleasant tree for shade, sir, at a spot a bit under the mile from the back of the vicarage. And I sat there quiet for a minute or two with the birds and all. They were beginning to sing again, I remember. And you know how memory strays back, though sometimes it's more like a goat tethered to a peg on a common. I was thinking over what a curious thing it is how one man's poison is another man's meat. For the funeral over and all that, the old gentleman had thanked me for all I had done. You see, what had gone before had been hard breaking his trust of a man. And he looked up from his bed at me, almost with tears in his eyes. He said he wouldn't forget it. He used the word substantial, sir, and I ought by rights to have mentioned that he was taken ill the night of the inquest. A sort of stroke, the doctor called it. Though he came round, I must say, remarkably well, considering his age. Well, I'd been thinking over all this on the fringe of the woods there, and was on my way back again to the house by the field path, when I looked up as if at call and saw what I take my oath I never remembered to have seen there before. The scarecrow. And that right in the middle of the cornfield that lay beyond the stream with the bulrushes at the back of the house. Nothing funny in that, you may say. Quite so. But mark me, this was early September, and the stubble all bleaching in the sun, and it didn't look an old, scarecrow either. It stood up with its arms out and an old hat down over its eyes, bang in the middle of the field, its back to me and its front to the house. I knew that field as well as I know my own face in the looking glass. Then how could I have missed it? What wonder then I stood stock still and had a good long stare at it. First because, as I say, I'd never seen it before, and next because... But I'll be coming to that later. That done, and not to my satisfaction, I turned back a little and came along on the other side of the edge, and so, presently at last, indoors. Then I stepped up to the upper story to have a look at it from the windows. For you never know with these country people what they're up to, though they may seem stupid enough. Looked at from there, it wasn't so much in the middle of the field as I'd fancied, seeing it from the other side. But how, thought I to myself, could you have escaped me, my friend, if you had been there all through the summer? I don't see how it could, that's flat. But if not, then it must have been put up more recently. I had all but forgotten about it next morning, but as afternoon came on I went upstairs and had another look. There was less heat haze or something, and I could see it clearer and nearer, so to speak, but not quite clear enough, so I whipped along to the Reverend's study, him being still, poor gentleman, confined to his bed. In fact, he never got up from it. I whipped along, I say, to the study to fetch his glasses, his binoculars, and I fastened them on that scarecrow like a microscope on a fly. You will hardly credit me, sir, when I say that what seemed to me then most different about it, different from what you might expect, was that it didn't look in any ordinary manner of speaking quite real. I could watch it with the glasses as plain as if it had been in touch with my hand, even to the buttons and the hatband. It wasn't the first time I'd set my eyes on the clothes, either, though I couldn't have laid name to them. And there was something in the appearance of the thing, something in the way it bore itself up, so to speak, with its arms thrown up at the sky and its empty face, which wasn't what you'd expect of mere sticks and rags. Not, I mean, if they were nothing but just real like that there chair, I mean, you're sitting on now. I called George. I said, "George, lay your eye to these glasses." And his face was still a bit discoloured, though his little affair in the stable yard was now a good 3 weeks old. "Take a squint through these, George," I said, "and tell me what you make of that thing over there." George was a slow, dawdling mug, if ever there was one, clumsy-fingered, but he fixed the glasses at last, and he took a good long look, and then he gave them back into my hand. "Well," I said, watching his face. "Why, Mr. Blake," he said, meaning me, "it's a scarecrow." "How would you like it a bit nearer?" I said, just offhand like that. He looked at me. "It's near enough in them," he said. "Does the air round it strike you as funny at all?" I asked him. "Out of the way funny. Quivering, in a manner of speaking." "That's the heat," he said, but his lip trembled. "Well, George," I said, "heat or no heat, you or me must go and have a look at that thing closer sometime. But not this afternoon. It's too late." But we didn't, sir. Neither me nor him, though I fancy he went on thinking about it on his own account in between. And lo and behold, when I got up next morning and had slid out of my bedroom early and went along into the corridor to have another glance at it, and believe me, sir, as you looked out into the morning, the country lay as calm and open as a map. It wasn't there. The scarecrow, sir, it wasn't there. It was vanished. Nor could I get a glimpse of it from downstairs, through the bushes this side of the stream. And all so still and early that even there from the back door you could hear the water moving. Now who, thinks I to myself, is answerable for this jiggery-pokery? But it's no good in this world, sir, putting reasons more far-fetched to a thing than are necessary to account for it. That you will agree. Some farmer's lout, I thought to myself, must have come and moved the old mommet overnight. But that being so, what was it ever put up for? Harvest done, mind you, and the crows, one would think, as welcome to what they could pick up in the stubble, if they hadn't picked it up already, as robins to house crumbs. Besides, what about the peculiar looks of it? I didn't go out next day, not at all, and there being only George and me in the vicarage, and the Reverend shut off in his room, I never remember such holy quiet. The heavens like a vault, 84 in the shade by the thingamy and the veranda, and this the 4th of September. All day long, and I'll vouch for it, the whole 20 acres of that field, but for the peewits and the rooks running over it, lay empty. And when the sun going down, the harvest moon came up that evening, and that summer she showed up punctual as a clock the whole month round. You could see right across the flat country to the hills, and the nightjars croaking too. You could have cut the heat with a knife. What time the old gentleman's gruel was gone up, and George out of the way, I took yet another squint through the glasses from the upper windows, and I am ready to own that something inside of me gave a sort of a hump, sir, when, large as life, I saw that the scarecrow was come back again. Though this is where you'll have, if you please, to go careful with me. What I saw the instant before I began to look, and to that I'd lay my affidavit, was something moving, and pretty rapid too. And it was only at the very moment I clapped the glasses onto it that it suddenly fixed itself into what I already supposed I should find it to be. I've noticed that, though in little things not mattering much, before. It's your own mind that learns you before what you look at turns out to be what you expect. Else, why should we be alarmed by this here solid sometimes? It looks all so, but is it? You might be suggesting that both Shape and Scarecrow too were all my eye and Betty Martin, but we'll see later on about that. And what about George? You don't mean to infer that he could borrow to order a mere fancy clean out of my head and turn it into a scarecrow in the middle of a field and in broad daylight too? That would be a long bow, no mistake. Aye, and take it in some shape for what we did. No, yet, as I say, even when I first cast eyes on it, it looked too real to be real. So there's the two on the one side and the two on the other, and they don't make four. Well, sir, I must say that from that moment on, I didn't like the look of things, and never have I shared a meal so mum as when George and me sat to supper that evening. From being a hearty eater, his appetite was fallen almost to a cipher. He munched and couldn't swallow. I doubt if his victuals had a taste of them left, and we both of us knew as though it had been printed on the tablecloth what the other was thinking about. It was while we sat there, George and me alone, him on the right and the window opposite, and me on the cupboard side in what was called the servants' hall, that we heard some words said. Not what you could understand, but still words. I couldn't tell from where, except that it wasn't from the Reverend, and I couldn't tell what. But they dropped upon us, and between us, as if there was a parrot in the room, clapping its horny bill, so to say, motionless in the air. At this, George stopped munching for good, his face little short of green, but except for a cockling up inside of me, I didn't make any sign I'd heard. After all, it was nothing that made any difference to me, though what was going on was, to say the least of it, not all as it should be, and if you knew the old vicarage, you'd agree. Lock-up time came at last, and George took his candle and went up to bed. Not quite as willing as usual, I fancied, though he had always been a glutton for his full meed of sleep. You could notice by the sound of his feet on the stairs that he was, as you might say, pushing of himself on. As for me, it had always been my way to sit up after him reading a bit with the Reverend's Times. But that night I went off early. I gave a last look in on the old gentleman, and I might as well mention, though dilatory isn't the word for these doctors, even when they are called in reasonable time, I say a nurse had been sent for, and his sister was now expected any day from Scotland. All well there, and him lying as peaceful on his bed as if the end had come already. Well, sir, that done, coming back along the corridor, I blew out my candle and stood waiting. The candle out, the moon came streaming in, and the outside from the window lay spread out beneath me almost bright as day. I looked this ways, and I looked that ways, back and front, but nothing to be seen, nor heard neither. Yet it seemed not more than one deep breath after I'd closed my eyes in sleep that night that I was stark wide awake again, trying to make sense of some sound I'd heard. Old houses, I'm used to them. The timbers crinkle like a beehive. But this wasn't timbers, oh no. It might maybe have been the wind, you'll say. But what chance of wind with not a hand's breadth of cloud moving in the sky, and such a blare of moonlight as would keep even a field mouse from peeping out of its hole? What's more, not to know whether what you are listening to is in or outside of your head isn't much help to a good night's rest. Still, I fell off at last, unnoticing. Next morning, as George came back from taking up the breakfast tray, I had a good look at him in the sunlight, but you couldn't tell whether the marks round his eyes were natural, from what had gone on before with the other, or from insomnia. Best not to meddle, I thought. Just wait. So I gave him good morning and poured out the coffee, and we sat to it as usual, the wasps coming in over the marmalade as if nothing had happened. All quiet that day, only rather more so, as it always is in a sick-room house. Doctor come and gone, but no nurse yet, and the old gentleman I thought looking very ailing, but he spoke to me quite cheerful, just like his old self, too, to be sympathising with me for the double duty I'd been doing in the house. He asked after the garden, too, though there was as fine a bunch of black grapes on his green plate as any out of Canaan. It was the drought was in his mind. And just as I was leaving the room, my hand on the door, he mentioned one or two compliments about my having stayed on with him so long. "You can't pay for that out of any bank," he said to me, smiling at me almost merry-like, his beard over the sheet. "I hope and trust, sir," I said, "while I am with you, there will be no further fuss." But I had a surety, even as I said the words, that he hadn't far to go, so that fusses, if come they didn't really much matter to him. I don't see how you would be likely to notice them when things are drawing to a last conclusion, though I am thankful to say that what did occur was kept from him to the end. That night there came something sounding about the house that wasn't natural, and no mistake. I had scarcely slept a wink, and as soon as I heard it, I was on with my tailcoat over my nightshirt in a jiffy, though there was no need for light. I had fetched along my winter overcoat too, one the Reverend himself had passed on to me. This very coat on my back now, and with that over my arm, I pushed open the door and looked in on George. Maybe he had heard my coming, maybe he had heard the other. I couldn't tell which. But there he was, sitting up in bed, the moonlight flooding in on his long white face and tousled hair, and his trousers and braces thrown down anyhow on the chair beside it. I said to him, "What's wrong, George? Did you hear anything? A voice or anything?" He sat looking at me with his mouth open as if he couldn't shut it, and I could see he was shaken to the very roots. Now, mind you, here I was in the same quandary, as they might call it, as before. What I'd heard might be real, some animal, fox, badger or the like, prowling round outside, or it might not. If not, and the house being exercised, as I said, though a long way back, and the Reverend gentleman still in this world himself, I had a kind of trust that what was there, if it was anything, couldn't get in. But naturally I was in something of a fever to make sure. "George," I said, "you mustn't risk a chill or anything of that sort." And it had grown a bit cold in the small hours. But it's up to us, our duty, George, with the Reverend at death's door and all, to know what's what. So, if you'll take look around on the outside. I'll have a search through on the inn. What we must be cautious about is that the old gentleman isn't disturbed." George went on looking at me, though he had by this time shuffled out of bed and into the overcoat I had handed him. He stood there, with his boots in his hand, shivering, but more maybe because he felt cold after the warmth of his sheets than because he had quite taken in what I had said. "Do you think, Mr. Blake," he asked me, sitting down again on his bed, "you don't think he has come back again?" "Come back? Come back," he said, just like that, and you'd have supposed from the quivering of his mouth I might have stopped it. "Who's George come back?" I asked him. "Why, what we looked through the glasses at in the field," he said. "It had his look." "Well, George," I said, speaking as moderate and gentle as you might do a child, "we know as how dead men tell no tales. Let alone scarecrows, then. All we've got to do is just to make sure. You do as you're bid, then, my lad. You go your ways, and I'll go mine. It was never any harm can befall a man if his conscience is easy." But that didn't seem to satisfy him. He gave a gulp and stood up again, still looking at me. Stupid or not, he was always one for doing his duty, was George, and I must say what I call courage is facing what you're afraid of in your very innards, and not mere crashing into danger, eyes shut. "I'd laugh not go down, Mr. Blake," he said. "Leastways, not alone. He never took much of a liking to me. He said it'd be evens. Not alone, Mr. Blake." "What have you to fear, George, my lad?" I said. "Man or spectre, the fault was none of yours." He buttoned the coat up, same as I'm wearing it now, and he gave me just one look more. It's hard to say all that's in a fellow creature's eye, sir, when they are full of what no tongue in him could tell. But George had shut his mouth at last, and the moon on his face gave him a queer look, far away like, as if all that there was of him, this world or the next, had come to keep him company. I will say that. And when the hush that had come down on the house was broken again, and this time it was the wind, though away, high up over the roof, he didn't look at me any more. It was the last between us. He turned his back on me and went off out into the passage and down the stairs, and I listened until I could hear him in the distance, scrabbling with the bar at the back. It was one of those old-fashioned doors, sir, you must understand, just loaded with locks and bolts, like in all old places. As for myself, I didn't move for a bit. There wasn't any hurry that I could see. Oh no, I just sat down on the bed on the place where George had sat, and waited. And you may depend upon it, I stayed pretty quiet there, with all that responsibility, and not knowing what might happen next. And then presently what I heard was as though a voice had said something, very sharp and bitter, then said no more. There came a sort of moan, and then no more again. But by that time, I was on my way on my rounds inside the house as I'd promised, and so out of hearing. And when I got back to my bedroom again, everything was still and quiet, and I took it, of course, that George had got back safe to his... Since the fire had faded and the light of day was gone, the fish-like phosphorescence of the gas mantles had grown brighter, and this elderly man, whose name was Blake, I understood, was looking at me out of his white, almost leper-like face in this faint gloom, as steadily almost as George must have been looking at him a few minutes before he had descended the back stairs of the vicarage, never, I gathered, to set foot on them again. "Did you manage to get any more sleep that night?" I said. Mr. Blake seemed to be pleasingly surprised at so easy a question. "Well, that was the mistake of it," he said. "He wasn't found till morning. Cold for hours, and precious little to show why." "So you did manage to get a little sleep?" But this time he made no answer. "Your share, I suppose, was quite a substantial one." "Share?" he said. "In the will." "Now, didn't I tell you myself," he protested with some warmth, that, as it turned out, wasn't so, though why it would take half a dozen or more of these lawyers to explain. And even at that, I don't know as what I did get has brought me anything much to boast about. I'm a free man, that's true. But for how long? Nobody can stay here in this world forever, can he?" With a peculiar rocking movement of his small head, he peered round and out of the door. "And though in this world," he went on, "you may have not one iota of harm to blame yourself for to yourself, there may still be misunderstandings, and them that have been deceived by them may be waiting for you in the next. So when it comes to what the captain of the Esper—" But at this moment our prolonged tete-a-tete was interrupted by a thick-set, vigorous young porter carrying a bucket of coals in one hand and a stumpy torch of smouldering brown paper in the other. He mounted one of our chairs, and with a tug of finger and thumb instantly flooded our dingy quarters with an almost intolerable gassy glare. That done, he raked out the ash-grey fire with a lump of iron that may once have been a poker, and flung all but the complete contents of his bucket of coal onto it. Then he looked round and saw who was sitting there. Me he passed over. I was merely a bird of passage. But he greeted my fellow derelict as if he were an old acquaintance. "Good evening, sir," he said, and in that slightly indulgent and bantering voice which suggests past favours rather easily earned. "Letting a little light on the scene? I didn't notice you when I came in, and was beginning to wonder where you'd got to." His patron smirked back at him, as if any such trifling human attention was a peculiar solace. This time the porter deliberately caught my eye, and his own was full of meaning. It was as if there were some little privy and ironical understanding between us, in which this third party was unlikely to share. I ignored it, rose to my feet and clutched my bag. A passenger train had come hooting into the station, its gliding lighted windows patterning the platform planks. Alas, yet again it wasn't mine. Still, such is humanity. I preferred my own company just then. When I reached the door, and a cold and dingy prospect showed beyond it, I glanced back at Mr. Blake, sitting there in his greatcoat beside the apparently extinguished fire, with a singularly mournful look, as of a lost dog, on his features. He was gazing after me. He seemed to be deploring the withdrawal even of my tepid companionship. But in that dreadful gaseous luminosity there was nothing, so far as I could see, that any mortal man could by any possibility be afraid of, alive or dead. So I left him to the porter. And, as yet, we have not met again. Today's story was Crewe by Walter de la Mare. It was read by Jasper L'Estrange. I hope you enjoyed it, and until next time, sweet dreams.